Hi, I'm Michael Wren of Hepzibah Baptist Church, and this is episode 13 of my series, Answering Unbelief. It's my objective to provide answers to equip Christians with the resources necessary to answer questions often asked by unbelievers. There's no reason why we as Christians should be silent about our faith. There's no reason why we should be intimidated by the questions of unbelievers, even if there are questions that we cannot answer in their entirety. There are answers to be found, and there's no reason for us to lack confidence in the Scriptures. And so, I'm endeavoring to answer a series of questions that unbelievers might ask about the Bible and about Christianity. In the last episode, I began answering the question, hasn't science disproven Christianity? I began that in the last episode. I will continue it in this episode and on into the following episode, episode 14. And as we consider that question, hasn't science disproven Christianity? I want to deal particularly with the scientific method in this episode. I want us to be able to see the scientific method for what it is and understand that the scientific method, though it is valid, it does not guarantee that the results of scientific research are always reliable. There's no reason why science and Christianity should be in conflict. There's no reason why we should distrust the methods of modern science. That does not mean that we necessarily agree with all of the findings or even with the prevailing theories that are often prevalent among scientists. We should be able to both at the same time critique the findings of science, critique the methods of scientists, and evaluate our own ability to read and interpret Scripture accurately. We want to be able to interpret the Bible accurately and understand science properly so that we can stand on solid ground. Let's endeavor to do both together. I will do a little bit of both as we attempt to answer this question. But today I want to focus on the scientific method. It's important that we understand what it is and what it is not. What is it that science can answer for us, and what can it not do for us? Science is the study of the universe based upon the findings of our own experience. Science investigates the universe and looks for evidence to answer the questions that it asks. It depends upon observation. The scientific method involves formulating a hypothesis, crafting an experiment to address the hypothesis, obtaining the results of that experiment, and then drawing conclusions based upon those results. Now, that's a solid method, and that method has produced an inestimable amount of change in our world from the time in which scientific processes really began until today. There's been so much change. The scientific method, has stood the test of time and has produced tremendous results. But that doesn't mean that the findings of every scientist are necessarily always accurate. The scientific method, it works, and it gives us really important information. But we can't always trust what our senses tell us. For one thing, the scientific method can only give us conclusions that are based upon the results that are found. We can only draw conclusions based upon what we observe. And we can only observe that which can be experimented upon. And there are some things that we just can't experiment upon. Let me give you an example. For instance, Mount Vesuvius, which erupted in 78 or 79 AD in Italy. Mount Vesuvius erupted. That it erupted, we have no doubt. And though no one alive was there, we know Mount Vesuvius erupted. Why? Two things. First of all, the documents from history demonstrate there were a lot of eyewitnesses that saw it, that described the event, and so we would have no reason to doubt it just based upon the historical testimony. And then, of course, there's all the geologic evidence of the massive pyroclastic flows and lava and so forth that came from the volcano all at about the same time at that point in history. And so you've got geologic evidence as well, and it shows us, based upon the findings that we have discovered, that this thing really did happen. The evidence leads to a conclusion. And why do we know it's that conclusion? Because the evidence demonstrates that it had to be a volcanic eruption. What else would it be? What else would account for all the evidence? If there was another theory that would lead us to a different conclusion, it should be explored. But there's not, because it was obviously a volcanic eruption. Evidence leads to conclusions that are drawn. But that doesn't mean that every conclusion drawn is really based upon the evidence. That's a point that we as Christians should take very seriously. Because scientists, though we respect their work, they don't always draw good conclusions. It's not just in fields of science. As one who's trained as a historian, I can tell you that historians make the same mistakes all the time. One book that I read probably 7 or 8 years ago, it's not one I would ever expect you to read. It's a book called Early Libyan Christianity. It's about Christianity in North Africa in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century AD. I read it because I was interested in the topic. I'm interested in early Christianity. I've got dozens of books on the topic. I read this one. I wanted to pick it up because Thomas Oden wrote it. Thomas Oden was, in the late 20th and early 21st century, one of the leading theologians of early church theology, or early historical theology. Thomas Oden was one of the leading voices in historical theology, really sort of touting the importance of the early church fathers. And so I was interested in what he had to say. Well, Thomas Oden is not a great historian. He's passed away now, but his historical work was not very solid. What he would do in this book, and it's interesting, as I read it, I realized I didn't underline a single thing in this book, but I still remember the insights I got from it. Oden built his book off of hypotheses. He would make a hypothesis about something that he thought happened. I think this happened, and I think it happened this way. And then he would lay out all of the reasons why he thought it might have happened this way. But they were speculations. Based upon maybe reasonable speculations, but they were all speculations. And then he would turn to another hypothesis, and he would construct another hypothesis. And then at the end of all of this, he's built hypothesis after hypothesis. And then he draws these sweeping conclusions, which are interesting, which are dynamic, which are compelling, but they're based upon unproven hypotheses, a bunch of them. Now, he may be right about most or all of the things that he has claimed in this book, but somebody else is going to have to prove them because he didn't. And that's exactly what scientists can be guilty of as well. They take a hypothesis, they look at evidence, they construct evidence, they evaluate evidence. Sometimes they do it inaccurately, sometimes they're sloppy, sometimes they allow their own biases to come into play and tell them things that aren't really true. We really are, as human beings, prone to bias, and we must be honest about that. How is it that intelligent, educated, disciplined people, such as scientists, can draw conclusions that aren't really based upon the evidence? Because we as human beings are biased. The act of drawing a conclusion is a human act. We have to take the evidence, we have to use our own reason and logic, and we have to construct conclusions based upon that evidence. Take Vesuvius as an example, where as it seems rather obvious to anyone that all of the volcanic rock around this mountain, which we know to be a volcano, was the result of an eruption, somebody else may have an alternative theory. Maybe there's some alien technology that turns sedimentary rock into igneous rock. Maybe that sounds reasonable to somebody. We construct conclusions based upon the evidence, and it's not always rational. It doesn't always make sense. Scientists can be guilty of this just as much as anybody else. And so we are biased. We have a tendency to look at the evidence that we see in front of us and believe that evidence demonstrates our conclusion, even if there is a more reasonable conclusion that could be drawn, because we've convinced ourselves that it's true. We can see this, I think, in the theory of evolution. Now, I am not a scientist. I don't have an extensive knowledge of science. I didn't take an extensive number of science courses through my education. I've heard lectures and I've heard people talk, and I've listened to Answers in Genesis, and I've listened to this group and that group. And so I've heard things, and I have some things to offer, but I'm not a scientist. And if you really want to study this in detail, you really should look at many of the great works that have been done over the last few decades dealing with issues related to science. I was given this book a few months ago, right before the pandemic hit. It's called Glass House, Shattering the Myth of Evolution by Ken Ham and Bodie Hodge. I read a lot of books, and most of what's in this book is really, really good. I was a little bit skeptical about it, but most of the stuff that's in this book is really good. There are chapters written by chemists, by doctors, by experts in biology, and they offer a lot of great insights critiquing the theory of evolution. It's a helpful book. There are a lot of flaws in the theory of evolution. I'm not going to be exhaustive about it. I just want to point out a few things and encourage you, if you want to study this further, that there's a lot of material out there to investigate and to read. But that there is a conflict between the theory of evolution and the biblical teachings of Christianity is rather obvious. Evolutionary theory holds that life emerged through random processes over millions of years from a single-celled organism to the diversity of complex life that we see around us today. The Bible obviously teaches that life is not the product of a random process, but the creation of God himself, and that there was no evolution from single-celled organisms to diverse, complex life, but rather that God created everything according to its kind. And so there's obviously a lot of discrepancy there. Could evolution be true and Christianity be true at the same time? Not if you follow the teachings of the Bible. Not if what the Bible teaches us, as it was understood by its original readers, is true. So, what would we say about evolution then? Well, there are serious flaws in evolutionary theory, and I just want to deal just briefly with some of those flaws. First, and maybe perhaps the longest standing criticism of evolutionary theory, is that there is no evidence for what's known as macroevolution. Now, there's a difference between what people call microevolution and macroevolution. What does that mean? Those are big words. Well, there's no real dispute that there is microevolution. That is, that there are mutations within a species. There's no question that that's the case. That species mutate, particularly as different individuals breed and DNA changes over the course of time through the process of breeding. You see changes in species, but there is no evidence for macroevolution. There is no evidence that genetic mutation ever leads to a new species emerging out of another species. There's simply no evidence documented for that whatsoever. There's no evidence of one species giving birth to an entirely different species. It's simply not there. It's interesting that Charles Darwin, in 1859, in his Origin of the Species, he asserted that he believed that this process was true, but he also said, look, there is no fossil record of this kind of evolution at the moment. He assumed it would eventually show up in the fossil record, but it never has. And that's led really to a radical revision in evolutionary theory. Because at one point, Charles Darwin asserted that evolution happened gradually over the course of millions of years. But what scientists found was that for huge portions of the fossil record, there was absolutely no change whatsoever. And so this caused them to argue instead that there are perhaps dramatic moments of change over the course of millions of years rather than gradual changes. And so now they hold to a theory called punctuated equilibrium, that there are these moments of dramatic change. But once again, there's really no evidence concluding this. This theory has the benefit, at least, of ignoring most of the fossil record, which is convenient, but there's no overwhelming evidence for it. So this is a massive flaw in the theory of evolution. The entire point is that there is gradual change from one organism to a new species over the course of millions of years, and there happens to be no fossil record of that whatsoever, no evidence even in our understanding of genetics that this is actually the case. So again, scientists doing research, finding evidence, drawing conclusions, and sometimes those conclusions aren't in line, aren't consistent with the evidence. Another weakness of the theory of evolution has to do with the origins of life. In terms of the origins of life, as I said, evolutionary theorists believe that life emerged through random processes. This means ultimately chemical processes. Life emerged through chemical processes. Well, as it turns out, most chemists believe this to be true, but there is no theory that actually holds water. There's never been a test that's demonstrated this, that chemicals can ultimately end up producing life. There's no evidence of that. There are no theories that actually work, even theoretically. In fact, one chemist, and this is found in the book Glass House that I just showed you, one chemist, a man named George Whitesides, has argued, and this is written by Alan White in the book Glass House. George Whitesides, an organic chemist at Harvard, said this: "The origin of life. This problem is one of the big ones in science. It begins to place life and us in the universe. Most chemists believe, as do I, that life emerged spontaneously from mixtures of molecules in the prebiotic earth. How? I have no idea. On the basis of all the chemistry that I know, it seems to me astonishingly improbable." So you have there the bare admission that we have this theory, we all hold to this theory, and there is not one single shred of evidence that demonstrates this theory is even possible. Why should we have the conviction that this theory explains the world we live in when it is not consistent, when it is not demonstrable, when there is no evidence for it? And yet this is precisely what you have in the theory of evolution. The truth is that evolution has become the theory that explains everything and the theory that explains everything. And its core assumptions are not demonstrated. Every theory is used to explain, the theory of evolution is used to explain all of life, and every finding is used as support of the theory of evolution. But there's no evidence for it. And the research that's done often is very shoddy. Let me give you an example of that. This is from an article that I read literally last week. A new study has come out where researchers have determined that the maximum number of planets in our galaxy that could possibly host intelligent life is 63. Where in the world did they get that from? Well, it wasn't from their research, because we have no idea. We've never found life on other planets. We really have no way to determine at this point, scientifically, if there even is life on other planets, because they're just so far away and our tools are so archaic when it comes to studying things that far away. But what they did was, they built this assumption, this conclusion, they built off of a few assumptions. First of all, on the assumption that life developed on Earth over the course of millions of years. And they have a timetable for that, and they assumed based on that timetable that it took like 4.5 million years for life to develop on planet Earth. Based on that, based on their assumptions about what chemical processes are necessary to produce life, which, as I said, are also not proven and have never been demonstrated, and based thirdly on the circumstances that are necessary for life to exist, as in the temperature on a certain planet, the chemicals necessary for oxygen and water and so forth. Based on those things, which are a little more concrete. Based on all three of those factors, they said there are only 63 planets in the galaxy that we know of that could possibly host intelligent life. But there's a whole bunch of assumptions based on that. Why people take studies like that seriously, I have no idea. All the processes that they have used to help arrive at that are all based on assumptions, except for, of course, the need for oxygen and water and things like that. And so that study really is worthless. It's completely worthless. It is worthless speculation that is clothed in the guise of scientific research. And it's nothing any more different than the philosophical musings of an ancient Greek philosopher. It's nothing more than that. And so that's just one study to give you an example. Another study that I've seen just in the last couple of months. Scientists have determined that the genome for Neanderthal is 99.5% identical to the genome of a human being. They were astonished by this. They were astonished that Neanderthals were that close genetically to human beings. Far more close genetically, far closer than our closest living example, which would be a chimpanzee. They're about 10 times closer than the chimpanzee. It's amazing. So what do we do with that? Well, I really don't know exactly what we do with that, but it tells us that the assumptions that Neanderthals represent a completely different branch of the evolutionary tree are obviously in need of significant revision. Scientists draw conclusions. Those conclusions make headlines, and those conclusions have to be dramatically revised time and time again. It's just a few examples of how scientists draw faulty conclusions. Let me give you a few other examples that come outside the realm of biology. And I don't know much about astronomy, and I don't know much about geology, basically nothing. But I've read a few things and seen a few studies over the course of time. What about the age of the universe? Astronomers have argued that the age of the universe is some 13 or 14 billion years old. What did they base that on? They base that ultimately on something known as the Hubble constant. The Hubble constant. What is that? Hubble, the great scientist for whom the telescope is named, he determined the rate of expansion of the universe. That is, how fast the universe is expanding. He determined that based on his own observations. And that formula for the rate of expansion is the basis for modern astronomy's understanding of the age of the universe. So they kind of took the rate of expansion and decided, based on that rate of expansion, we know how big the universe is, or have some idea of how big the universe is. So therefore, we know how old it is, how big it is, how fast it expanded. Follow the formula, basic physics. We know how old the universe is and how big it is. So that was the assumption that modern astronomy is built off of. But in the last couple of months, it's been determined that the Hubble constant is wrong. In the words of one scientist, and I saw this in the paper, I think it was just last week, or maybe earlier this week, he said, galaxies are closer together than we thought. New observations have revealed that the universe is definitely not as big as we thought it was, which means that the Hubble constant has to be wrong. And so astronomers are revising their understanding of the size and the age of the universe. So what do we do with that? I don't know what we do with that. It just demonstrates once again that the assumptions that fuel scientific conclusions are often wrong. Even well-intended researchers make mistakes. So given that, understanding those things to be the case, what do we as Christians think about modern science? It tells us that we should be very careful to scrutinize the findings of modern science. Am I willing to jettison the truths found in Scripture because some scientists have published a study that says that Genesis is wrong? No. It seems irresponsible to do that because scientists are revising their conclusions all the time and demonstrating faulty assumptions all the time. One more thing, one more observation. Many people have asked me about radiocarbon dating. They hear Answers in Genesis say that radiocarbon dating is inaccurate. What do we do with that? Well, Answers in Genesis believes in a young Earth that's only thousands of years old, and modern scientific consensus is that the Earth is millions of years old, billions of years old. Well, if radiocarbon dating is inaccurate, then maybe we can throw the scientific consensus out the window. Well, here's what has recently been discovered about radiocarbon dating. Scientists have concluded that radiocarbon dating is, in fact, inaccurate. Recent scientific study that was conducted in Israel on tree rings from about the year 1600 to about the year 1900. They examined tree rings from that time period and the radiocarbon dating of those trees. Because you can count the tree rings and determine the years. And so they compared that with radiocarbon data. And they determined that on average, the radiocarbon dating was at least 19 or 20 years off. So it's obvious that radiocarbon dating is not completely accurate. And they now know that it's based at least partly on the fact that organisms take in radiocarbons at different rates at different times of the year, particularly plants. Take in radiocarbons at a different rate at different times of the year, and at different rates depending on the hemisphere they happen to be in. And so those are two variables that had never been accounted for before. So radiocarbon dating isn't entirely accurate. Is that enough to take an Earth billions of years old, life that's hundreds of millions of years old, and render it down into a thousands of year time span? Well, the scientific consensus won't come to that conclusion, but it's enough at least for us to be able to question the findings of modern science and say, you know what, the Bible is the Word of God, the Bible has demonstrated its accuracy, and I may not always understand exactly what it says, but I'm not going to throw its teachings out the window because science has said that life on Earth is billions of years old, and that we came from random chemical processes that have never been demonstrated. Why should we distrust the Bible when the Bible has demonstrated itself time and time again to be presenting us the truth? Scientists, on the other hand, make mistakes all the time. That's not to denigrate the work of scientists. It's just to say that every conclusion should be scrutinized properly, but with solid critical thinking skills and with good, solid evidence. So hopefully that gives us some idea of what we do with the findings of modern science. We need to be doing the work ourselves. We need Christians who are willing to step into the arena of scientific research and do research themselves, not only in science, but in history and in literature and all of the other fields. Conclusions are skewed based on our own biases. We need Christians who are doing the work from a Christian worldview, helping to hopefully bring the world towards more sensible conclusions on some things. And when it comes to whether or not science has disproven Christianity, I think it should be evident by this point that the answer conclusively is no. Science is not nearly accurate enough for us to be able to trust when it comes to big questions like that they simply aren't even qualified to answer. In the next episode, we're going to look at the other side of this question, and that is how we make sure we're interpreting the Bible properly with respect to science. Thank you for your attention. As always, I appreciate it, and I hope this video and this episode has been helpful. God bless.